Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Writers Drinking Whiskey Open Bar, the show where we talk unironically about truth and beauty and ironically about everything else. I am your host that always overserves, so you should probably lose those keys, William R. Hincy. And joining me tonight, I got a really phenomenal panel. John McElroy, Dario Terriello, Michael Kozlowski. Everybody, welcome to the bar.
Thank you, Bill.
Oh, William.
Awesome. And so I'll have the full description in the bios here. So if you want to find any of the work, websites, anything, just click that little box. If I can find the thing, I'm not a seasoned YouTuber yet. But if you want to find anything there, it'll be there for you. One of my favorite topics to get into on this show is writing rules. I like my air quotes. I like to do them very aggressively too. The writing rules, the great said debate. And so I've heard this both ends of the spectrum here, so I'm going to present it to the panel. So true or false, you should never use any other word to describe dialogue, right? It's just you use said or you use nothing, and you absolutely do not use an adverb because the way to hell is paved via adverbs, according to Mr. King. So you will not use an adverb to describe that said. What say you, panel? And then maybe we'll start opposite direction this time because I'm going by how it looks on my screen. Let's start with you this time, Mike.
All right. So I'll give that said and asked are both the same because,
Sure. Yeah, fair enough.
I would say, like with most things, it's a balance, right? And I'd also say King does not follow that rule at all. So as most people who make rules do not follow their own rules. But I think it's a balance. You can certainly overuse the adverbs or the, she said, miserably or whatever, she groaned. But then sometimes it's important to inflect, without changing your sentence. You might want to, like, especially like something like sarcasm, like, oh, that's great. If you just said that's great, she said, okay, she thinks it's great. But if it might be she's great, that's great. She groaned, right. Mm-hmm. So sure. Sometimes I think it's necessary, but if you get a whole paragraph of adverbs, and it would drive you nuts, right? So.
Right. That's hilarious that you said that because it's one of the things that it always reminds me of is that every rule that everyone's going to present, you will be able to find bestsellers, award winners, and your favorite authors that will break that at times. Yeah. So nothing's really a rule, maybe a guideline at best, but some people take these things very seriously. So I think that is an important distinction. I also think that, there's that idea that, and I don't think it's an idea. I think there's truth to it that you reveal a lot of character through dialogue and you advance plot many times through the dialogue that's said. So it's carrying a lot of weight. It's carrying a lot of the information you're managing forward. So you want the dialogue to be kind of the golden piece. And so if you're using exclaimed and things a lot, it may be that the dialogue isn't up to snuff. So it may give you a hint.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The more and I'll always use said as a default, right? That's usually the first, right. Unless it just flows really cleanly that I should have something else. But always said, and then maybe I'll go back and look at that and see if it's right. But I agree with that. It forces you to make the dialogue better.
Right. Yeah. And I think some of the rules start like that. They're almost for like beginning writers, and then it's like, no, you break them. But I think that's partially the thing is if the verb you're using to describe the speech is doing the work, that's probably bad. Right. I don't think there's any. To me, words are tools. You use the right one for the job. But it's sometimes said's the right one. Sometimes groaned, like you said, that might be another right one. So, Dario, you wanna chime in?
Yeah, you may have to stop me on your questions today because they're good ones, and you know that I'm a libertarian when it comes to rules. It's an unfortunate outgrowth of the internet that with all the writing bloggers and groups that people get very black and white on this stuff. And my answer to most writing rule questions is it depends. And I really agree with what Michael said and what you said about dialogue, quality of dialogue. So generally said is really transparent, and I'll use it by default. Asked and replied, yeah, sometimes, not so much. Anything fancy like he ejaculated, which used to be a very common one in 19th century fiction, we try and avoid.
Before erotica got really big. We used that a lot. And then the media just went nuts from there.
It was big in Victorian fiction.
We were so repressed, of course.
I maybe occasionally, suggested or commented in place of said, but keep it to once or twice in a book, for God's sake. Elmore Leonard was the real Nazi on this. He always used said. I think it was Leonard. And you had two questions in one. The adverb one, well, they're related. Exactly what Michael said. I'm a big fan of King's too. He uses adverbs, yes. Some writers who are very successful use adverbs by the bucketful, like J.K. Rowling, for instance, and dialogue tags and things like that. Bottom line is, unless you're trying to be a literary writer, it doesn't matter much as long as the reader is on board and stays on board. And I think, as Bill said, they're all tools. Parts of language and punctuation are all tools, and you use them when you need to. It's much more efficient if it's not apparent in the line of dialogue. It's much more efficient to say, she said softly, than to preface it or follow the dialogue by, her tone was soft. Sometimes it's just more efficient. Nobody cares. Readers don't care about this stuff.
Right. That's a brilliant point. I think that a lot. There's writer debates, and lots of writers are readers, but fair enough. But there's the I'm a writer reader, and versus just I read books because I enjoy it. The writer readers will be into he said and she said all the time. The other people, I don't think they care one iota. I mean, as long as they understand what's happening.
To that point, I think we talked about it actually on the show last time. I'm much more critical of writing reading, other people's writing, right? Because I write now, I enjoy reading so much less. I have so many more, do not finish books, right? Because I'm reading like, so
I have trouble finding new books to read. I do a lot of rereading.
Oh, really?
Yeah, really.
Which I used to think was weird. Like I would have said like rereading a book is really weird back in the, but then, as I thought about it, I'm like, there's 100 movies I'll watch every time they come on, and I'll watch it again, even though I know what's going to happen, and the reading, I'm much less likely to remember much of the book, right? I'll remember the very end, but so I reread more now than I ever did, but I would have said that was weird as hell before.
Sure.
You guys really nailed it on the set and ask. And I mean, I really have no authority or platform to disregard rules, but I probably do. And it's largely a function that I've kind of backed into writing, and I kind of religiously avoid kind of how-to books. I mean, I just try to kind of write on instinct, and I don't know whether it works. And I do recognize, and I think both of y'all said, said's kind of a default. But when I go back and redraft, saids tend to migrate, to groans and whispers and you name what. The asks tend to stay kind of asks. I don't fancy that around. But, I don't know. I agree with you guys. I don't think anyone really cares other than people that, maybe people who teach writing, and I think I trespass enormously on that rule, particularly on the said issue. Adverbs, I love them. Put them in there. I think I probably use them too often. What the heck?
Right?
Well, and I think fair enough. I think one of the things, if you're starting out, right, and I mean, I guess whatever we're all trying to improve, right? I always look at it like I'm just trying to be the best writer I can be, right? So I'm just trying to maximize that. One of the things I think you can look at is, one is if you look at it, you don't always have to, there's quotes around it. You don't always have to say a person said it, because there's little marks around it all of the time to say someone said it. So if you take that set away, it can actually be really interesting as how well does that dialogue stand on its own. So, and sometimes you can do this too much. And I think I've certainly probably done it occasionally too much, to where you don't, give the reader kind of a sign who's saying. And I try to be mindful of that, because the worst thing you can do is confuse somebody to where they don't know who's talking anymore. But it can be a real indication of if your dialogue is distinctive enough, if it's vital enough, right? There's always this in the show Dario and I did that'll air by the time this one comes out, it'll be out. We talked about show, don't tell. And there can be that I want to show it, so a character's going to say it. And it may not be worth someone saying, right? And so if you take that set out and just leave it there, you may look at it and be like, I could just narrate what just happened here. This isn't worthy dialogue. And keep the dialogue to something that's punctuating the point or revealing character. I think of it a lot. Like what I say reveals a lot of my character. All of us, it really reveals a lot about us and what's happening. So I think if you take those out, it can be a good trick to see how well does your dialogue stand up. How well are you revealing the characters? Can you kind of see them apart, when they talk? That can be a little tricky. Like you gotta play that, because if you get too into it, you get too into the phonetic, into the dialect and all of that, it can be its own mess. So there's a balancing act to it. But it is an interesting exercise to go through.
I find I strike quite a lot of he said or she said when I'm editing. They're often unnecessary, especially in the middle of a paragraph. Every few, you're talking about script writing. That's the perfect example of dialogue. And yes, if the character voices are distinct enough, you need less tags. Otherwise, it is after about 4 exchanges, readers kind of lose it if the voices aren't so distinct. So you throw in a tag. But they're overdone quite often.
Bill, you may have been at this particular Short Story America conference. Do you remember that John Engel reading a story that he'd written? It was a very short story that had a poetic rhythm to it. It was a constant, he said, Baba, she said, he said, she said. It was so repetitive. It was magical. It was lyrical. I mean, it just was. I remember I went up to John afterward and I said it was spellbinding. I mean, short, simple sentences. It never broke. He said, she said. So there's a case where it just worked beautifully. Beautifully. I wish I could remember that short story's name, but it was breathtaking to listen to. So sometimes it works better reading, perhaps, a story to get that kind of rhythmic repetitiveness. Anyway, great writer, John Engel.
I'd say that to your point of not using the tags at all, I do that in my fiction writing regularly. Because for this very debate, like it's in my head, in the back of my head, that I'm using said too much. Should I not? So I'll challenge myself not to use a dialogue tag at all. Usually, then when I go back for my second draft, and I rarely write more than 2, partially because I'm lazy. I'll then, as I'm reading it, then you see it, or I always have a first reader, like we talked about before, and they'll say I lost track of who was talking or whatever, and then you go, okay, I need a tag there. But yeah, that's a great exercise. I think everybody should do for dialogue.
Yeah, sure.
It also depends a little on. And this is getting a little kind of geeky, but it depends on formatting as well. I actually just finished an edit for someone today where the same character had paused between two lines of dialogue, and the author had given the new line a fresh paragraph without, and still used all the quotation marks.
Okay.
So that confused me right away. And, I said, put them on the same line, and or say, he paused and, he paused a moment then. So a lot of, at a kind of nuts and bolts level, some of it is simply to do with the way you've formatted the sequence of dialogue with gestures, and accompanying body language. Sometimes people format that a little weirdly. They'll have two characters plugged into the same paragraph with one talking, the other reacting, and then the same one talking again. That can get kind of confusing.
Well, and to format, I guess, your writing perspective as well, right? Is, if you have a format, which I have had this in some of my books, where it's really one character kind of per chapter, right? And it's their perspective. Rarely do you then need the dialogue text. That's
you're talking
that person, right?
Yeah.
So, so then you can just throw them all away,
Sure. Well, I'm glad we got there, because actually that was the other piece of this I wanted to talk about. Is there's I've heard them called different things, but kind of the action tags, the dialogue tags, to where instead of saying said, it's to get back to your point, Mike, when it was if it's sarcastic, right? And I wouldn't do this too often because rolling the eyes can get very old. I've had teenage daughters. Rolling the eyes gets super old. Okay, it's like I want everyone know. But that can actually be something, right? Where they go, right. Janice rolled her eyes, and then you get that. Okay, that was there, right? So you can actually. What I try to look for is there an interesting action? Like, I don't want everyone shaking their head all the time, but is there something organic that maybe that character would do?
Yeah, shrugged. He shrugged. Right.
Yeah.
Nodded.
I think I throw a lot of shrugs in. I
think I do as well.
I think a lot of my characters are just shrugging through life. I don't know what.
I have to watch my noddings. They do that a lot. All these little gestures and I find it harder to get the gestures and the body language and the simply getting people up and down the stairs and into the car. I find that's more than half the effort of writing is just that background stuff. The connective tissue.
Interesting.
I think the last one we did, Dario, Matthew Kaye was on, and Matt had described that as blocking, right? It's like kind of the blocking and tackling. It's like when you have a play, there's blocking, and you cut stage left, cut stage right, and there is that actually would be a really interesting question for a future episode. Just how do you the blocking aspect of it? Like, how do you fit that in a natural way? Sometimes you just need to move a character, right, and get them to the bus stop, and that's where the interesting stuff happens. You don't want to spend an hour moving them to the bus stop if nothing happens interesting during that hour.
I think the people that do that well too, you really notice because they do it very succinctly. Usually, it's like one or two words, and you know exactly what that person did and how they moved and what they were looking at, what they were thinking, and I catch those every once in a while in a book, and with the critical eye now that unfortunately I have to read with, and you catch me and go, wow, that was amazing.
Sure. William, it just occurred to me, and again, I write really short stories, as I said, and I say this sincerely, that I've never really done any formal kind of training in this. And a lot of time, I think I just kind of don't know the blocking and tackling to get people to get to where they need to go. So I do page breaks. That's kind of my blocking and tackling. I guess it's kind of the poor man's block or tackle, because I've just kind of, let's get some space in there and put those little squiggles and then start afresh. And let that white space.
It's like a fade to black, right? Or like that. Yeah.
No, I never thought about it that way, whether that's a legitimate, but it seems to get me off the structural issue of, well, they're there, and that's then. How do we get there? And it seems to work. I don't know.
That's the thing. If it works, it's okay. To hell with anybody's rules.
I love it. I love
whether it works and keeps the reader turning the page and not confused. You got it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And Mac, you've mentioned a couple of times, you've said you don't have formal training. I don't have any kind of formal training
Really?
as a writer. I think most writers don't. The ones that do, you can almost always tell. And that's probably one of my, dislikes on my Bumble app is writers with formal training.
I keep going back. I keep trying to amend, my turnoffs. I'm going to add that one. Boy, I'm going to step on some toes, but that kind of academic.
Sure, it's a pompous.
You know what I'm trying to say.
I'll step on toes
Pedantic,
for you, Matt. It's the MFA program.
All right, you said it. I won.
There you go.
Yeah, and some of them are great. Some of them I adore, but there's a certain professors writing to other professors, MFA student writing to other MFA students, and it gets very pedantic and very
they're the
technical
people that
and
push these rules, right? That we're talking about. They're the ones that are going to call you out because you said too much. So, don't be apologetic, Mac. Particularly not in this group.
I'm just worried that we're going to get some midnight knockers tonight from the Association of Writing Professionals.
I live in Detroit. They won't even come to my house to be scared.
You're safe.
Cheers.
Yeah, very true. Well, that's true, right? There is the difference. Like literally, this is my wife. My wife isn't going to watch this, so she's in the house. She may overhear it. I'm afraid she doesn't, because this drives her crazy. I walked away from school 3 classes from my bachelor's.
That's hilarious.
There's 2 reasons. One is it kind of amuses me that I walked away 3 classes away, and like I had a great career and things. I was doing well, still doing well. There was no issue there, so it became less financially necessary. The bigger point was I really felt like it was making my writing worse. That every time I went into a class, because I had an old professor many, many moons ago, during my AA, that said, you kill to dissect. So it's like, I want to know Moby Dick, so I have to kill it to dissect it. You lose the magic. Like you've talked a few times, Mike, like you don't enjoy reading it so much, right? Because once you shoot the bird, if the bird's not as interesting anymore, it doesn't fly anymore. And you can dissect it and get to the parts that made it fly, but it doesn't fly. You don't get to witness it going. Like that's a huge difference between me, poisoning the eagle with DDT or whatever and looking at its dead body versus actually watching it like in the air. And there was a real part of that to where once I did that, I was publishing before, and then suddenly nothing was getting accepted. And I realized I hated all of my writing. And all of that I ended up throwing in the trash. Some of the stories I kept and just rewrote, distilled down to like their point and tried to get to what's the art of it. I don't think art necessitates schooling.
So I was a art major, and so not writing, but fine art and graphic design, and almost the exact same story. I probably a semester short of my bachelor's degree, and it was financial things too. I was had a whole other job going, but I quit because I was almost like selling out to get the grade. I had a few different professors who were like, and you'd learn what they liked, and it's like, okay, well, I guess this is what I'll make today because that's what they want to see. And I was like, man, I really hate doing this now. So it's like a mirror experience, other than that it wasn't writing, but.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Before we move on to the next question, anything else, Dario, Mac, anyone want to add to the conversation here?
A great conversation.
No, that was good.
Thanks for tuning in. The show is a labor of fun, and it's truly a reward in its own right. But if you would like to support me or the other amazing authors I have on there, consider picking up a book. Any of the writers we have on here would be a great addition to your bookshelf. Each one is a master storyteller and just a great person to boot, so you'd be doing them and yourself a great favor in picking those up. And while I would never call myself a master, because that would be, as we said in the 90s, conceited, I do have on a pretty good authority from critics and my mom alike that I'm not bad. So if you wouldn't mind picking up one of my books, that would be great as well. I would appreciate it. Thanks again for watching. And thanks to my great panel of guests for coming on and spending this time with us. Cheers.